Welcome to Whistle Stops, a special program series from the Truman Library Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our final trip down the tracks. I'm Cassie Pekarsky, Director of Strategic Initiatives and host for our journey through the all-new permanent exhibition at the Truman Presidential Library Museum after a spectacular $29 million renovation. At every stop along the route, this series has provided you with special access to the fascinating galleries, artifacts, films, and stories inside. Now, before I give the last all aboard, I'd like to give a quick thank you to our generous Whistle Stop series sponsor, Black & Veatch. The privately funded Truman Library Institute proudly supports Harry Truman's legacy in partnership with the Truman Presidential Library and Museum in a variety of impactful ways. For more information about the important work we do, please visit trumanlibraryinstitute.org. While you're there, you can watch all of the stops in the Whistle Stop series on the past events recordings page of the website or on the Institute's YouTube channel. There, our guest conductors will guide you through the museum's immersive introduction film, Truman's formative years, his journey to the Western Front of World War I, his relationship with Kansas City boss Tom Pendergast, and his partnership with Tom Beach. Today, the train has gone quite the distance from Independence to Washington, D.C. In the last room of the Plow to Politics Gallery, visitors find Truman in the nation's capital as a U.S. Senator. Visitors can follow his evolution from the senator from Pendergast in the letters he wrote home to Bess and Margaret to the Truman Committee, exploring the group's efforts in an interactive puzzle alongside artifacts, political cartoons, and documents from Truman's 10 happiest years in the Senate. For today's journey, it's my honor to introduce you to our conductor, who once held the same Senate seat as Harry Truman. Claire McCaskill grew up in a political family, and public service has defined her adult life. First as a lawmaker in the state of Missouri, then as a county prosecutor and Missouri State Auditor. In 2006, Claire became the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate from Missouri. Today, she's a political analyst for MSNBC and NBC, a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, and a longtime supporter and dear friend of the Truman Library Institute. Claire, the controls are all yours.
Thank you, Cassie. First, I've got to say, I think this is one of the cruelest things that has ever been done to me, because I have 30 minutes to talk about somebody in the Senate who I know an awful lot about and who I am really kind of been a fangirl since I was in junior high. And so this will be a little tough for me. I'm going to look down, not because I need my notes, but if I don't look down, I'm afraid I'll go far afield and start telling Harry Truman stories, and we won't get through the slides and the presentation about his years in the Senate. You have to start with Harry Truman by admitting he was really not a very good politician. And then you have to add into that the fact that he won when he wasn't supposed to. He was always the underdog. He was always considered the guy who wasn't going to win. He never had a race for the Senate. He had two of them that was easy. They were tough. And so this is a man who was very used to being underestimated. And he was not very good orator. He wasn't flowery. He wasn't a backslapper. But he did do one thing that served him so well throughout his career. He worked incredibly hard. So his first campaign for the Senate, he had been searching about after, building a new courthouse in Independence and building a new courthouse downtown in Kansas City for Jackson County. He was called a county judge. His job was really a county commissioner. And he was looking around what he was going to do next. Bess did not want him to run for Congress. He wanted to run for Congress, but he was passed over by the Pendergast machine for a congressional bid. And so much to his surprise, Aylward and Pendergast came to him and said, "We want you to run for the Senate." Now, as usual, Harry was not at the top of anybody's list. He was like the third or fourth person who was asked to run for the Senate. Everyone else had said no. But Harry didn't have any money. In fact, Aylward and Pendergast each gave him $500 within a few days of him agreeing to do this. And so off he went in 1934 to run for the Senate. He had two opponents in that primary, and they were both formidable. They were both congressmen, sitting congressmen. One was from St. Louis and had the backing of the St. Louis political organizations. His name was Milligan. And then there was a Cochran who ran, who was from Richmond, Missouri. And he was also a sitting congressman. And Harry Truman was like, nobody thought he had a chance. But Harry got in his car, as he always did. He loved his car. He loved to drive. And in a very hot Missouri summer, he went from county courthouse to county courthouse, 15-hour days, morning till night. And the people who traveled with him, and he had one man who traveled with him almost constantly, were amazed at his stamina and how he seemed to really, I mean, to him, it felt like a vacation, he said at the time. He liked being on the road. He liked moving around and meeting people. And the picture in the slide in front of you is frankly kind of representative of some of the crowds he had in some of the small counties around the state where just, you know, a few people would show up to hear him speak. But that didn't stop him. And much to everyone's surprise, he won the race. He won it by 40,000 votes. He split out state where he'd worked so hard to get the farmer vote, since he thought he could relate to the farmers more so than the other two candidates. He won by 40,000 votes, and he easily beat the incumbent in the general election in November. Missouri was a very Democratic state back in those days. He spent a whopping $12,286 on his primary, and he spent even a more amazing sum of $786 on the general election. He went off to Washington, and there for the day that he was sworn in was Pendergast and his wife and his daughter. And as Pendergast left him in Washington after Harry had taken the oath of office, he said the following: work hard, keep your mouth shut, and answer your mail. So in Washington, Harry Truman decided that he would in fact keep his head down and be quiet. He wrote his wife on their 16th anniversary, and he said the following. He was lamenting the fact that he was never going to make any money. And this is one of the ironies of Harry Truman being under a cloud during much of his political career because of his connections with people who were unsavory. Harry Truman was so honest, he was always broke. And so in this letter, he is lamenting to Bess about that he's not going to make a lot of money, but he's hoping to make a reputation as a senator. But saying, of course, I won't sell influence. I'm perfectly willing to be cussed if I'm right. And he, in fact, was cussed many, many times. The Pendergast cloud stayed over him. This was a man who came to office because of his huge margin of victory in Jackson County, which was attributable to the political organization of Tom Pendergast. A lot has been written about what Harry Truman knew or didn't know, and you had a whole session on Pendergast, so I won't go there. But suffice it to say, even though he never was dishonest, and there was never any inkling in any of the investigations that were done that he had done anything wrong, he stayed loyal to Pendergast, and it hurt him in the Senate. He had an inferiority complex when he first got to the Senate. He was known, as Cassie mentioned, as a senator from Pendergast. He remembered the people who were kind to him when he got to Washington. In fact, he told a reporter that he asked to show him around. He said to him, "I'm green as grass. I need your help." And the reporter was startled because he wasn't used to senators admitting any kind of vulnerability or any kind of hesitancy about whether or not they belonged there. But Harry wasn't afraid to let people see that he was not a blowhard. He wasn't sure of himself. So what did he do? He, once again, just worked harder. Harry would walk a couple of miles to the Senate every morning, and he walked at a brisk pace. He would get to the Senate no later than 7 a.m. every single morning. And in fact, he was so early that they finally gave him a pass key so he could let himself in the building. They had never before had a need to give a senator a pass key but there'd never been a senator who wanted to get to work as early as Harry Truman did. He listened. He took his committee assignments very seriously. He studied the subject matter. He lamented that none of his fellow senators checked library books out of the Library of Congress, but he did, stacks of them. When he was on the Commerce Committee, he would devour volumes about the railroads, their management, their business practices, because he was investigating the railroads and what they were up to as part of his work on the Commerce Committee. For the first 3 years, he wasn't taken seriously, but everybody who did spend some time with him liked him. His likability was a huge weapon for Harry Truman in the United States Senate. He never gave a speech for the first 2 years he was in the Senate. In fact, he said very little. Although he tried to be helpful to particularly his constituents, he answered his mail and to people at home. He finally began speaking near the end of his second year in the Senate. It was not a showy oratory. It was a boring speech full of facts and figures. The classic Truman speech was first in December of '37. And this is really when he began to make a mark. In fact, this speech was covered on the front page of the New York Times. He went after the lawyers and the bankers. He went after those people who were privileged in the country. It really showed his hatred of people that worshiped money and greed. And it was for Harry, it was quite a speech. It really was the first memorable speech he gave. He'd given one earlier that was full of facts and figures, but this was the one that people remembered. He also gave a speech in his first term that really was a very dumb thing to do. He gave a speech basically defending Pendergast at one point and going after Governor Stark, who then would turn out to be his opponent in the next election. Governor Stark led to the downfall of Pendergast, along with a U.S. attorney in Kansas City by the name of Milligan. And the bottom line is that Harry Truman had Pendergast as an anvil around his neck while he was a senator. And he really only got free of that anvil in his second term. So let's talk a little bit about his second term. We can go on to the next slide. In his second term, after beating the governor, and by the way, that was another election. Let me not just gloss over the second election, the toughest election of his career. The second election, once again, he had two opponents, but this time one was the governor, and this governor was full of himself. And Harry Truman was confident that if he didn't attack this governor, Stark was his name. He was an apple farmer from northern Missouri. That Stark would frankly do it himself. He would hurt himself by his ego and the way he handled himself. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. There were some things that Stark did that didn't sit well with most Missourians, like having the guy that drive his car salute him every time he walked by. Those were the kinds of things, putting on airs, that most Missourians just didn't cotton to. And certainly Harry Truman was not that guy. The other candidate was the same U.S. attorney who actually prosecuted Pendergast. So he had two people going against him, once again, accusing him of being Pendergast's bellhop, a Pendergast stooge, not his own man, accused him of being deceitful. And once again, Harry Truman just campaigned on loving Roosevelt and the New Deal and outworked him. He just simply outworked him. And this time he won by a very, very small margin, only 6,000 votes, but he won. And once again, it was against the odds. His second term is what would catapult him into national prominence. And it began very simply, in very classic Harry Truman style. He liked facts. He liked figures. He was not big on hyperbole. He was not big, certainly on flowery speech. He was a very plain-spoken man. He got to the point, and if the point he made you didn't like, well, just tough. And when he came back for his second term, first of all, he was celebrated. Many of the Democratic senators had come out and campaigned for him, but he was considered dead man walking before that campaign began. And once again, he showed people that he, even though he wasn't a particularly skilled politician, he was good at winning. And he, I think, enjoyed that he was the underdog. What happened with the Truman Committee is his constituents, some of his constituents contacted him and said, they are wasting a lot of money building Fort Leonard Wood. And for those of you that aren't from Missouri, Fort Leonard Wood remains one of a major Army training base in the United States. It does have joint capabilities now, but it was built as an Army base, and it is a place where many of our military go for basic training as they join the military. That was being built as Harry Truman was campaigning for his second term. And when he got in, he got all these reports about waste. And what did Harry Truman do in classic Harry Truman style, which just makes my heart go pitter patter? He got in his car and he drove himself. I think it was a Dodge, a 38 Dodge. He loved his cars. He got in his car, drove from Washington all the way down to Florida, then back up through the Midwest and then to Michigan. And the stops he made along the way were to places that a lot of money was being spent on our defense. And he was shocked and saddened by what he found. He found equipment laying around the ground at Fort Leonard Wood that clearly was ruining and was wasted. And he realized that something was terribly wrong. So he then went to the floor and said, gave a speech on February 10th of 1941. He gave a speech on the floor and he asked for a special committee to be created just to investigate the defense industry as it relates to war profiteering. It had a special name, the National Committee on Defense something, but nobody remembers the name of the committee because from the very day it began, it was known as the Truman Committee. In the pictures of the slides in front of you, this is one of the first hearings that the committee had, and this was actually in Kansas City at the Mulebach Hotel. These are the senators. There were 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and then they added a Democrat later. So I'm not sure exactly who's in this picture, but that was the committee as it was gathering to begin a hearing on a Midwest Defense Transportation Center. And you can see Harry there actually touring that center with the committee on their work. One of the things they found, which was fascinating to me when I first learned about this, when I really dug into the Truman Committee, was that what they had done in the effort to get things done quickly, to build up the defense capabilities of the United States as Germany was rearing its ugly head and with a war over in Europe. Harry found and the committee found that there were all these cost plus contracts. And this is personal to me because when I was campaigning for the Senate for Harry's seat, I certainly was aware of the Truman Committee and the work it had done. And I was certainly aware that there was a lot of costly things going in Iraq. Imagine my surprise when I got to Washington and I started digging in and I found that the biggest problem in Iraq, cost plus contracting. And basically what cost plus contracting does for defense companies, it says no matter what it costs you, you get to add on a profit. So the incentive of the company is to do more. That's how we got monogrammed hand towels in Iraq. And that's why Harry Truman and his fellow members of his committee found so much waste and abuse in the run-up and the armament process for World War II. The work was consequential that the committee did. It was it was substantive. And Harry Truman ran the committee with a really iron hand. He was not interested in people coming in front of the committee and scapegoating others. He was not interested in the military coming to the committee and saying, well, but we wanted it quickly and we had to do it fast and blah, 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 blah. He just wanted the facts. He wanted to uncover what we were paying and why, and what we were getting for the money. I could tell many specific examples of what the Truman Committee uncovered, but maybe one of the best ones is U.S. Steel. Now, U.S. Steel, obviously a very, very powerful company in the United States at this period of time, and a company that the country really needed. Obviously, steel was key for a lot of the work that needed to be done to get the weaponry that the United States Army and Navy and Marines were going to need as we began to participate in World War II. But U.S. Steel, they discovered, was actually providing substandard steel plates for Navy vessels. And in fact, some of these plates actually broke on a ship, a Navy ship. And they then began digging in. And they discovered in the hearings that there was actually a ledger that was kept at the company. And when the steel plates passed the specification, it was written in a book in ink. And then when it didn't pass specification, it was written in the same book and still delivered to the Navy, but it was written in pencil with the letter F. And the Truman Committee was able to get the person who made those entries into the ledger to admit under oath that the word F stood for fake, that they were actually providing steel plates to the Navy that did not meet the specifications, and obviously putting many lives at risk by providing substandard materials to the Navy. That's one example. There were many. His hard work, his love of the road, his penchant for facts and details, his refusal to grandstand, but rather to really hitch his star to being hyper prepared, is how Harry Truman came to national prominence. And the Truman Committee made big news, as you can see in these cartoons. This is the Truman Committee report, and this is clearing the way towards victory. Harry Truman was really seen as a hero. He was not seen as somebody who was trying to deny the military what they needed. He was seen as someone who was trying to give the military what they needed, but deny the big companies war profiteering on the backs of the soldiers that were risking their lives and losing their lives in the name of freedom. And here is another cartoon of National Hot on the Trail with the Truman Committee going after defense contractors and people who were building army camps. There were really two phases to their investigation. The first part was investigating all the army camps that were being built and all the war profiteering that went on there. And then they moved into the armament, which was really much more complicated and much more politically risky, because going after the people who were building the tanks and the guns and the ships, you risk being seen as someone who is anti-military, which obviously was not something that would be politically advantageous, especially for a senator from Missouri. So Harry Truman went from an accidental senator who got there only because of the help of a crooked political boss in Kansas City to beating the incumbent governor for his reelection, to really taking a position of national prominence by working hard and doing the right thing when it came to war profiteering. The other thing that I want to point out is that Harry Truman's political norm did not change when it came time for the vice president being selected. There was a lot of maneuvering behind the scenes as Harry Truman was a senator. He first was mentioned as a vice presidential candidate probably a year and a half before the convention. And meeting with, and by the way, Roosevelt wouldn't ever, everybody who talked to Roosevelt thought they knew what Roosevelt was going to do. Clearly, Wallace thought he had Roosevelt's support to be the vice president again. There were other candidates. There were Byrne and Barkley and all these others that were all circling, trying to become the vice president. Clearly, Roosevelt, while he wrote kind of a namby-pamby letter saying he liked Wallace, and if he were a delegate, he would vote for Wallace, it was pretty clear to the political heavyweights that he was really not pushing Wallace. And the way that Harry Truman emerged, the most unlikely in many ways person to get the nod, was once again through the political strength of political organizers, or in those days known as political bosses, in major cities across the country. And some of that was facilitated by Pendergast, and some of it was facilitated by a man named Hannigan, and others who worked, Flynn, who worked to get Harry the votes. And so even though there was a sense that Harry Truman was never going to be the vice president going into the convention, once again, Harry Truman emerged as, and by the way, his acceptance speech was, I think, 3 sentences long. 3 sentences long. He looked awkward in front of the microphones, and there was a little bit of worry that this plain-spoken, unassuming guy from Missouri maybe not have been the right guy, because there was no hours of oratory, but just 3 sentences. And the last sentence he uttered to the convention after accepting the nomination of vice president was, "Give me a chance." And of course, the rest is history. I left a lot out about Harry's time in the Senate. His ability to fight when he had to, especially when under attack, the friendships he made, how much he enjoyed the collegiality of the Senate, how he was never known to speak a harsh word to anyone, including his staff. He was someone who was very respectful. He may have used a bad word now and then, but never in the company of women. And of course, I left out his adoration of his wife and his daughter, and how hard it was for him to be alone in Washington, because Bess didn't like Washington much. She didn't stay there a lot. And it was hard for him because he wanted to be with Bess and he wanted to be with Margaret. They were a very close group, that 3, and their social life was very modest. There were no big flashy parties for the Truman family. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Harry Truman. I will tell you, he has been a really somebody that I have looked to throughout my career in public life because of his penchant for saying something simply, answering the question, not being afraid of the consequences, taking unpopular positions, and working hard. So what Harry would do at the end of the day, Harry was very careful and didn't drink a lot, but he would take a stroll with his fellow senators down to a room, many different hideaways in the Senate, where they would gather for a little bit of bourbon. Now, I will tell you, I have got a glass here of my favorite bourbon. It's not Tom Pendergast bourbon, but it's close. And so as I ask you to support the Truman Library Institute, and I wish you the happiest of holiday seasons and a Merry Christmas, I'm going to have a sip of Harry's bourbon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. What a wonderful way to close out our Whistle Stop series. The train is about to pull into the station for the last time because the Truman Library is now open. Thursday through Saturday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., you can discover firsthand some of the most dramatic chapters of world history in a cinematic experience, from immersive sound and light theaters depicting World War I and the Cold War, to a 14-foot interactive globe exploring the hard problems of peace following World War II, and much, much more. Learn more and reserve your time entry tickets today at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. While the Whistle Stop series may be over, have no fear. We have an exciting slate of programs lined up for next year. You can find information about all of our interesting programs by signing up for our email newsletter at trumanlibraryinstitute.org and following the Truman Library Institute on Facebook. Speaking of interesting programs, we have one more 75th anniversary to commemorate this year. Truman's signing of Executive Order 9808. In 1946, Black World War II veterans who had risked their lives overseas returned home to another fight for freedom. In the weeks and months following VJ Day, violence against Black Americans and veterans in particular soared. President Truman's response was clear, stating, "I shall fight to end evils like this." But he was frustrated, both by the judicial branch and the Southern Democratic bloc in Congress. Undeterred, Truman drew on the Constitution and his presidential powers and issued Executive Order 9808, creating a 16-member presidential committee on civil rights. Truman's landmark action 75 years ago this month was the first significant federal response to racial violence since Reconstruction. On December 15th, Richard Gergel, United States District Judge and author of Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard, and The Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Wadings Warren, will detail this dramatic and little-known chapter of the civil rights movement in America with an introduction from Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. Register for Freedom from Fear, Executive Order 9808, and Truman's Fight for Freedom at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. For now, we've arrived at the station and it's time to disembark. Thank you for coming aboard with us. We hope that you have enjoyed the journey as much as we have. Have a great evening.